Welcome back, everybody. This is Brandon Finnegan, co-founder of Decision Desk HQ. Today on Let Me Finish, I am joined by Catherine Swartz of Notice and Audrey Fahlberg of National Review. Now, just kind of starting things off, we're now a week after the major Democratic National Convention, and we'll start, of course, with what's on everybody's minds. Of course, is the polling. USA Today Suffolk has a poll out, a national survey of likely voters that finds Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by about 5 points, 48 to 43%. But of course, we all know we don't vote by the national popular vote. We vote by the Electoral College. So thankfully, we've also received swing state polls. Emerson and The Hill released a set of swing state polls. Of course, the famous blue wall states. In those surveys, they find Kamala Harris with a 3-point lead, 50 to 47. In Wisconsin, they find Trump edging by 49 to 48. And in Pennsylvania, they find the two candidates tied at 48 apiece. And of course, moving beyond the blue wall states, moving towards the Sun Belt territories, they find Donald Trump with a 3-point lead in Arizona, 50 to 47. They find Donald Trump also leading by 1 in North Carolina, 49 to 48, but finding Kamala Harris above 49-48 in Nevada, and Kamala Harris 49-48 in Georgia. In addition to the surveys that were released by The Hill and Emerson College, Fox News decided it was going to step in here and kick the tires on some swing state polls as well. In those swing state polls, all in the Sun Belt, they find Kamala Harris with a narrow lead in Arizona, in Georgia, and in Nevada, and trailing Donald Trump by 1 in the state of North Carolina. Now, it is important to remember that we were right after the end of the Democratic National Convention. We would expect there to be a polling bump or a polling high for the Democratic Party. In addition, Kamala Harris has been in her rollout campaign as the new candidate for the Democratic Party since approximately the third week of July, when President Joe Biden decided he was not going to run again, made that announcement. So if one's looking at polling, as we've been discussing here for several weeks, as other talking heads have discussed, we are going to be in the middle of what we would consider a Democratic bump. The question, of course, is one, is the bump sustainable for the Democratic Party, or does Kamala Harris start coming back towards earth? Donald Trump's vote share is considerably better in polling even now than it was at this point in 2020 or at this point in 2016. One could make the argument that while he slipped a little bit in the last polls that were conducted by Emerson and the last polls that were conducted by Fox when we were still polling against Joe Biden, the bigger difference has been the vote share for the Democratic candidate. It hasn't really been a massive amount of slippage for Donald Trump. And that's obvious, especially when you look at the polls from June, again, a month before President Joe Biden decided not to run again, where he was trailing in every single poll in Emerson. And so I'll just go ahead. I'll open up the discussion to both of you about what you're kind of gathering from these polls, these polling releases. If you think there's a lot to read in here, or if you're more of a classicist like me, where I'm still telling people, wait till after Labor Day. Audrey, we'll start with you.
I'll keep my comments brief. Brandon, I agree with you. We should wait until after Labor Day. Also because the polls will get interesting down ballot as well with a lot of these Senate candidates in particular. Most of the candidates who are up for re-election in the Senate are Democrats, and even with Kamala Harris with this switch, they've all pretty much maintained strong leads except for a couple. So that will be interesting. But with respect to the presidential race, yeah, I mean, she was always going to get a little bit of a polling bump. The Trump campaign had sent out a memo shortly after she became the new nominee, with a little bit of expectation setting here, saying that there would be a Harris honeymoon. I think that was smart expectation setting from them. But she's got a little bit of a polling bump, but it's not an enormous one, as you mentioned, Brandon. And I think that that's why this interview that she's having will matter, which we'll get to in a moment. And the debate will really matter a lot, because that's September 10th. That's when a lot of voters are going to start paying more attention, not to be cliche, but it's true. What about you, Catherine?
Well, really to echo your thoughts there, Audrey, I mean, I'm hearing the same thing from the Trump campaign, from people there that are really calling this moment a sugar high, to not look at it too closely. But in terms of the takeaways that I had from this, agree with you on Senate candidates. It was the same with Biden as it is with Harris, that we're seeing the Democratic incumbents pretty much across the board in these battleground states that have Senate races leading well over what Harris is leading over Trump. So that's a real big takeaway. And I think the results in the Sunbelt states, speak for themselves in these numerous polls. It's showing that Harris is opening up the map, and I think we're seeing a real response from the Trump campaign in the blue wall states, particularly with J.D. Vance, in response to the map opening up.
I feel, and we obviously need to go on to other topics other than just polls, because people will talk about polls till they're blue or red in the face, depending on their reaction to them. For what we've experienced this year, you could say this is a considerable bump for Harris, because she's now leading consistently in some important states, although again by very, very small margins. No, she's not taking away or pulling away in any of these states, in any of these places. She hasn't put Trump out of contention anywhere here in the polling. But again, and also it's early. So moving on a little bit from there, how about we go to kind of some other things? So what's on your mind, Audrey, beyond polling?
On my mind is Kamala Harris's first interview since becoming the Democratic candidate. This is significant for a number of reasons, right? Early voting is about to begin. Voters deserve to, in several swing states, voters deserve to know, is she quick on her feet? Can she answer really tough questions about her record and her policy platform, which is pretty light on details? As we saw at the Democratic convention last week in Chicago, the goal is to present her as this change candidate, which is a little ironic given she is currently in the White House. But you saw with the speeches from former First Lady Michelle Obama, she talked about the magic in the air, trying to revive that 2008 feeling. But if you look at her platform, I mean, I'm sure Dana Bash will ask her questions about, how light it is on policy. She talks on the stump a lot, as I know we mentioned in many shows, about pretty vague pledges to protect entitlements, protect abortion, protect Americans from gun violence. She has gotten a little specific on econ policy 3 weeks after she became the nominee. She outlined a few different proposals to expand the child tax credit, build more housing and subsidize it for Americans. But this will be interesting for a number of reasons, because as I mentioned, voters want to see if she can think quickly on her feet. And of course, if she has a couple gaffes, the Trump campaign will quickly whip those into ads that they'll air all across battleground states until Election Day.
Catherine, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, really, I'm hearing from strategists over and over again what's been echoed, that so far this has been sort of a vibes election since Harris entered in. We hear vibes over and over again. It's starting to lose any sort of meaning. But tonight really is this test, because the thing I hear over and over from voters in battleground states is there's still a hesitancy of, we don't know exactly what Harris stands for. People certainly know what Trump stands for, his record, his time in office, and also what he has been saying on the campaign trail. But there is kind of still this question in the air of embracing Biden's policy versus making her own. So yeah, there's that economic policy that you mentioned, Audrey, that's been laid out. But tonight really is the test of looking at that first 100 days, looking at the first day in office. What are the top priorities, and how exactly is she going about those?
Not that there's a pure equivalence to the two, but I do want to warn people about being confused too much by the strategy of being vague, or being, trying to be as many different things and not actually being anything at all when you're running for office. Harris's challenge is that she is the incumbent vice president. Her party is in charge of the White House, but she has to run as a change candidate because she needs to build distance, not just from the contrast from the opposition, Donald Trump, but from Joe Biden. Now, if you go back, and this is a deep cut for people, and probably anybody watching this was probably not alive for this, but if you go back to the 1988 campaign when George H.W. Bush was running, there had been 8 years of Ronald Reagan, but there were some thoughts about how Reagan had run the country at the time. People don't think about that now, but at the time, Bush did have himself a little bit of a challenge here. He had to distinguish himself from Reagan. He had to get out of Reagan's shadow. He had to project himself as a different kind of person. And Saturday Night Live very infamously did a mockery of this and a mockery of H.W. Bush, where he kept rambling about 1,000 points of light, stay the course, effectively saying lots of words and not saying anything at all. To which John Lovett says, Michael Dukakis says, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. We could see a repeat of that with the 2024 election, where she says she does outline policy on a website, or she says, this is what I'd like to do, and I have this person in charge of this, we're thinking about this, doing this. But the more she gets into specifics, there's more opportunities, there's more vulnerability for her, where people can then build up attack ads, start knocking down certain specifics that she'd like to outline. So if she's not being specific right now, it's for a very strategic reason. It's for a very sensible reason in looking at the history of campaigns. So moving over to you, Catherine, what's been on your mind besides, well, the polling and the interview that's upcoming?
Well, one thing really on my mind today is Harris and Walz are in Georgia. They're in rural stretches of Georgia, conservative areas, areas where there hasn't been much on the ground Democratic presence really since Obama. So again, pointing to the expansion into the Sun Belt. I've done a lot of reporting on the opposite side of things then, on the Trump campaign, how they're responding to Harris and Walz sort of opening up the map. And the focus is on Pennsylvania. So my colleague and I had a story that we're reporting out about specifically Trump and Vance and the prioritizing of Pennsylvania in response to this. So we have people close to Vance and in the Trump campaign that said Vance is spending more time in Pennsylvania than any other state in the next 60 or so days. But of course, voting starts much earlier, as you pointed out, Audrey. I think it's also exemplative of how the Trump campaign just a couple days ago put out a mail-in voting strategy for Pennsylvania, specifically Swamp the Vote USA. So we saw Vance yesterday in Erie. That is one of two counties in Pennsylvania that flipped from Trump in 2016 to Biden in 2020. He was there on a message, he was focused on truck drivers. That was his audience, but it was a real message focused on energy, focused on trade. And Trump tomorrow will be in Johnstown. That's also in Western Pennsylvania, where we're hearing and expecting a similar message. So really, again, as Harris opens up the map, it's looking at the blue wall and how states that Trump didn't necessarily need to win before in order to get to 270, now, as we're hearing from Republican strategists in the state, are becoming much more crucial.
It's an interesting point with those blue wall states that doesn't really get discussed a lot, because people tend to have a misunderstanding of where the votes are, where the votes aren't. Or I always talk about vote shares as opposed to the raw margins. Donald Trump, if he had performed about as well in his relative vote share in Philadelphia in 2020, if he had performed everywhere else in the state as well as he had performed relative to the previous cycle in Philadelphia, he would have won re-election in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia did not ruin Donald Trump. Philadelphia actually voted just slightly rightward in the margin between 2016 and 2020. Detroit did the same thing in 2020 over 2016. He actually lost Detroit by a slightly smaller margin than he had in 2016. What killed him were the suburbs around Philadelphia, the suburbs around Detroit. That's where he met his political end, at least in 2020. Now, it seems that the strategy of kind of camping out in a state, look, I can go on we can do an entire show of me just talking and rambling about Pennsylvania until I pass out. My wife would probably drag me off and away from this camera at that point. But it's an ideal state to position someone in. If the Trump campaign is serious about winning the election, it is all Pennsylvania. Because again, right now we're at this crest where, look at the polling averages, Harris is edging, and I mean by the smallest of margins in Pennsylvania. We're talking a point and a half in the average, right? She's trading leads in North Carolina, and Trump has a slight edge in Georgia. We would expect, if that crest kind of starts to fall back down and Harris settles into the high 40s, Trump would again retake his comfortable position he's had all year in Georgia and in North Carolina, but that still leaves him 19 electoral votes short. What state has 19 electoral votes? Pennsylvania, because it effectively means you win Pennsylvania, you're at 270, nothing else matters. So it is a very smart strategy to park someone, your vice presidential candidate, in the state of Pennsylvania. But that also comes to the argument about when they're at these rallies, when they're having these events, when Trump is talking with people, what should Trump actually talk about? There's two schools of thought here. There's a school of thought that he should stick entirely with some policies and message. What's the message he's using to attack Kamala Harris? Can he stick with it? Is that what his advisors are stressing him to do? Should he do that? Or does he keep throwing the red meat at his base, at the people who are there at the rallies to listen to him talk? Does he benefit from the energy of that. And so I'll ask you both, which is the right strategy for him to take? I'll start with Audrey. There we go. We'll start with Audrey.
Obviously, he should be hitting her on the issues. I think Trump and the word discipline are hard to put in the same sentence. But then again, that's part of his appeal. He's shocking, he's exciting, and he's funny to the voters who support him. Right. I'll leave you with this. My boss, Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, wrote a must-read New York Times op-ed, which is a little controversial. But he argued that he should be hitting Harris on character. And here was an interesting tidbit from his piece. Quote, everything has to be connected to the deeper case that Ms. Harris is weak and a phony and doesn't truly care about the country or the middle class. The scattershot Trump attacks on Ms. Harris need to be refocused on these character attributes. So that was kind of a different case that I think is interesting, from conservatives arguing that he should do more to hit her for being inauthentic and a shapeshifter on policy.
Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, with my perspective there is the argument about character and doing a character message, but particularly with Pennsylvania, which Brandon and I too could talk about all day, it really comes back to the Obama, Trump, Biden voters and their role in deciding the election. And polls are showing that this group, particularly older white men that fall into that group that voted for Biden, that saw themselves in Biden, particularly union workers, they are not fully settled on Harris yet. That's something I've been reporting on again and again. So if there's a message in Pennsylvania, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, to those voters that have flipped from 16 to 20 about where they're going, I think it is focused on those issues of energy and on trade.
All right. Well, with that, I think we should be wrapping things up for this edition of Let Me Finish. For Catherine and Audrey, thank you for joining us both again. And I want to remind everyone, of course, like and subscribe, of course, here on our YouTube channel. But for all of your polling needs, all of your analysis needs, everything you could possibly want when it comes to election 2024, you can find all the information you're looking for at our home site, decisiondeskhq.com. And just a reminder, we will absolutely be live and covering things through the general election, including the night of the general election, where we will have all the results, all the numbers, all of the projections, everything to your heart's content when it comes to the cycle that seems to never end. With that, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.